Hello, I'm xsinick and welcome to our tutorial series. Welcome to the xsinick show. This is a tutorial series that I'm beginning here, and we are going to start with Blender basics. You know, a lot of people out there would like to get into 3D art, creating models, creating animations, creating pictures with 3D, and they don't know where to start. So I think the best place to start is at the very beginning. How do you get Blender to work on your computer? This is the absolute basics. So, later in the series, hopefully we'll be able to get into more topics where you could start creating things, but this is the very beginning. Okay guys, so let's get right to it. So first of all, you have to start your computer by pressing the start button on it. And once your computer turns on, whether your computer is a desktop or laptop, you have to bring up an internet browser. So let's go to my desktop. Okay, here is my desktop. I have a crazy wallpaper. You could join our Discord if you like to have access to this. Okay, so I'm going to use internet browser to get Blender. So if you look on my desktop, I already kind of have it, but I'm going to walk through the steps on how to get Blender onto your desktop. So I click on an internet browser called Firefox. That's what I'm using. You can use Internet Explorer from Microsoft if you have Windows. You could use Safari if you have Apple, or you could use Google Chrome. Whatever internet browser you like to browse the internet with or to look at the internet, you can use it to get to Blender. Then here I have a search engine. Most internet browsers default to a search engine where you could look up whatever it is you want to find online. So we want to find Blender, so I'm going to type Blender 3D and press enter. So once you type Blender 3D, it's going to bring up the Blender website. It's going to bring up a whole list of different sites. So the correct website is called www.blender.org, and that's the first one that's in here in my list. So I'm going to click on that, and here we are, guys. We are on the Blender website. I'm going to make it big so you can see it. So what you're looking for is right here. There's a download button, or if you don't see any download button or anything like that over here, you can look to the top, and it's the second word in. It's called download. If you click on that, it'll take you to where this download button over here is going to take you also. I have a screen magnifier, so I'm going to use that to kind of zoom in, and so you guys could see exactly what I'm talking about. So this is a little box here. I'm going to use it and right here, so you could see the download button right here, or you could go up here in the menu section of the website. It has features and then download. So let's click on download. Okay, so whatever operating system you are using, you can press that button that would allow you to download that version of Blender for your operating system. Most of you out there would have Windows. So if you click on this gray button right here, most likely Blender would detect what operating system, and you could just click this big blue button. But just in case if you don't see Windows, if you're using Windows, you could click here on this gray button, and you have different Windows installers. It has the Microsoft Store, it has a portable zip file, and it has an installer. So this may seem confusing. What you would want is to use the installer. That's the much easier way to get it onto your desktop. If you're using Mac OS and Apple, you can use the Mac OS Intel, and then have the Mac OS Apple Silicon. Now these are different architectures for your Apple computer. So you could look at the manual for your computer to see which one suits your computer the best. But most likely the Apple Intel could work with most things. So you could click on that one. If not, if it doesn't work, try the Apple Silicon. and there's a bunch of other options. Now, I use an operating system called Linux, a computer called Linux. So I'm going to use the Linux button right here to download my version of Blender. As I said, as you go to the website, the download section, Blender would try to detect what operating system you're using on your computer, whether it be Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, and the blue button will display the one that you should download. So I'm just going to use the blue button here and click and download Blender for Linux, right? So it's, if you look to the top right here or anywhere on your computer where there's an icon, I'll zoom in, and a download icon, most likely you'll see it being downloaded. You see right here, it looks like a little pie chart of something being downloaded here. Right, that's what it looks like. It's downloading, and here they will bring up an opportunity for you to donate to Blender. You could do a one-time payment of I think it's like 25. I think this is euros, or sorry, yeah, I think that's what that is. Or you could go monthly subscriptions, and of course they would convert this to dollars and that kind of thing. To do a donation is nice if you could afford it. If you can't, you could just simply download it. It's free anyway. Okay, so the next thing is that you got to find out where your internet browser put the installer file for Blender. Most internet browsers, the icon that shows you where it's being downloaded, normally you could click on that, and then there's a little folder right here, and especially if you're using Firefox, and you can click on that and it'll open a browser showing the download location. If you don't have all that, most likely, I'll close the browser right now behind here, and let's go into our desktop. Most likely you would have to go to your computer, whether it be on Mac OS or Windows. Right now I'm on Linux. I'm actually using a version of Linux called Linux Mint. And if you look to on the list here, you would see downloads in most operating systems. So you click on that, right? And I have my Blender file here download. I have a bunch of other things that I downloaded before, but what you're looking for, if I go to list view, what you're looking for is something called Blender, and the newest Blender is 4.3. It could be whatever Blender at the time that you're watching this video, it's the same thing. I'm going to grab that file with my mouse by clicking the left mouse button and holding and putting that onto my desktop. Now I'm going to extract my version of Blender so I can see the Blender folder. So I'm going to right click on that and click extract here. Because for Linux, they put Blender in something called a zip file. And there's also zip files for Blender that you could download for Windows and even for Mac. I think it's some sort of package file for Mac. And it would create a folder where it was actually going to put the Blender program so that you can use it on your computer. There's also other types of files that will actually install it on your computer on the system itself, and that will give you these different icons. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up by getting rid of the download file for now, and here's a folder on my desktop with the newest Blender downloaded. So if I double click on that, you'll see that there's a bunch of files in here. What you're looking for is a file that simply says Blender. There's no other things associated with it. All these files are folders that Blender uses so that it could operate with different icons and different system files. You're looking for the file here that says Blender. So I'm going to click on that. Right? And right now it's opening Blender on my computer. So here it is, it's opened up. And this is what you'll be faced with when you open Blender. Blender is going to show you a big viewport, and then there's going to be a bunch of different icons and windows and all that sort of stuff. And what I'm going to do, because this is the very basics of getting Blender on your computer and starting it, I'm going to walk through what these different sections are on your in Blender. So what you're seeing, let's start with the top right here. I'm going to bring the screen magnifier. We're going to magnify. I'm just going to make this big here like so. I'm going to put it right next to my head so you guys could take a look. So check this out. So if we go up here, I don't know, if you look in the magnifier to the side, you'll see what I'm pointing at. Okay, so this right here is the main Blender menu. So you have this Blender icon. So when you click on that, it has things like the splash screen, about Blender, install application templates, systems. So this is pretty advanced, and you don't want to do that, and you don't want to touch this right off. But if you want to happen to see the splash screen for Blender, which is the opening art of the program, if you just want to see it, you click on that and it'll show you, right? And right here it has options for how Blender works. We're going to leave everything as is. So you just click to come off of that. Okay, so this is then the other this part here after this Blender icon shows you those things like about Blender and the splash screen. Next to it is file, and that's the single most important menu you need when you're operating Blender. So let's go into file right here. So I'm going to the top right here, the top left, and you have new, right? So if you click on new, you could create different new things. You could create a general file, a Blender file for general Blender work, like doing 3D modeling, animation, the whole works. Then there's one just specifically for 2D animation, right? And then there's one here for sculpting, and there's one for visual effects, VFX, and there's one for video editing. And this is going to throw Blender into these different configurations. So for now, we don't want to dive into these as yet. And then under new, you can open an existing Blender file. So once we create a Blender file and we save it and you want to open it again, you go here to open, and it will open in that Blender file. And under that is open recent. So Blender saves a history of what we have opened before. So if we, later on, if we make, a couple Blender files, instead of going to open and navigating on your computer, Blender would show you all the most recent files, so you could click on them quickly. So this is like a little shortcut. Under that is revert. So if we make mistakes in how the layout of this Blender is, and you want to go back to the way it was, click revert and it will go back to the way it was. There's a recover under that. So that happens if Blender happens to crash. Blender saves backup files that you can then click last session or autosave, and it will try to recover, try to open Blender just before the crash and bring your file back to that state just before it crashed. Under that is save. So once we create a new file, you want to save that file, and then you tell Blender where you want to save it on your computer for later. Then we have save as. Save as helps you to save a copy, right? Save it as like a different file name. And then there's also save copy, which is going to automatically just save a copy of what it is, the blend file that we're working on. And then there's incremental save, which Blender automatically just saves without you pressing any of these menu options here. And then we go into a bunch of other things. I'm just going to walk through those really quickly. Link here helps you to link an existing Blender file with the Blender file that you have open right now. So say if like we have one Blender file with a character in it, a guy, so let's say a guy running, and then in this Blender file here is like some sort of scene where there's a building and a car and he's running to his car. We could have one Blender file where he's running, and then we have this Blender file where we have a city with buildings and a car, and we could link that running guy into here and still keep the files separate. So we could still work on the one file with the guy running, and then we could still work on this file with the car and everything, and then we can link them together so that they look as if like everything is in one file. And then append is kind of like linking, but append actually adds objects from other files into your Blender file. So that's if you ever want to know how to merge different models and different materials and stuff from other Blender files, this is how you do it, by using the append. And then data previews. We could get, this is a deeper thing here, refresh data block previews. Excuse me, yeah, that was my alarm. Okay, so clear data block previews. We could get into this later. And then we have import, and this import allows you to import different 3D file formats. So if you have different files from other programs like FBX from any Autodesk programs, or you have a GLTF from any other gaming software, or a wavefront file from like from Maya and other websites. If like you purchase other models from other websites, you have different formats here. You could bring them in like Alembic and USD and so on and so forth. Export helps you to export or put or make copies of your Blender models that you have selected, or the entire scene, and have you export those to other file formats like the same ones we mentioned earlier: GLTF, FBX, wavefront object file, so that other programs could open them. Because natively, when you save and you save as and you save a Blender file, it saves it as a Blender file, and only Blender could truly open the file and have everything work properly. But if you want to save it so that you could use it in other programs like ZBrush, or you want to use it in Maya or 3D Studio Max, you have to use export to export your files to formats, to different file formats that those programs can open. External data is for additional files that help you make your Blender file. Things like images and things like that. You're going to use this to pack them into your Blender file, or to unpack images from your Blender file out to your computer, and so on and so forth. Cleanup helps you purge any unused data in your scene. So in creating objects, and especially in creating materials, sometimes you create 3-4 materials and you're only using one of those materials, and the size of your Blender file may be really big because you have unused materials and different things like that, and unused different types of data. And if you come here, cleanup, that helps you to purge unused data and that kind of thing, and to manage all those things. That's another deep one. And then and external data actually helps you to link missing files and that kind of thing. So under those two there is defaults. So defaults helps you to go back to factory settings. So if you see, it has like save startup file, so we could save the way how our Blender looks. So we could probably going to use this. So you could in this mode here, you could arrange the UI or the interface of Blender to the way that you like it. And then if you come here to defaults under file, you go file, defaults, and you could save the way that Blender looks. So every time you start Blender up, it's going to look that way. And if for some reason you don't want it, you want it to go back to the way it looks right here, you have to go File, Default, and Load Factory Settings, and it's going to go back to how Blender originally looked. And then of course we have Quit. If you click on Quit, Blender is going to close. So if I click Quit right now, Blender is closed. Okay, so that's the basics of getting Blender onto your computer and starting it up. So let me click on the Blender thing here and have it start up. Okay, so it starts up with the splash screen. I like the way everything looks. So once you see this, you're going to just click anywhere in the viewport. So let me further describe what you're seeing here. So this here is the main 3D viewport, right? Right now we're in a tab called Layout, and Layout is, think of it like the general home tab of Blender, where you can lay out your objects and your scenes, and you could do almost any kind of work with just using Layout. You don't need to necessarily go to these other tabs, but they put these other tabs to help you to to focus on whatever task you want to do here in 3D. Okay, so we have Layout right here. Then the next tab is Modeling. So if you click on Modeling and you have an object in your scene like this box, immediately it's going to go into modeling mode, where you have your different components that you can work on your 3D model. Now, a 3D model is made up of 3 main components. You have these points called vertices or vertex. Actually, 1 vertex, 2 vertices. That's how you say it. Vertices is plural. And then you have an edge, which is these lines that make up your 3D object. So you have points, then you have these lines, right? And then the other one is faces, right? So these sides of this box, what we like to call polygons, you could call them faces. They're made up of triangles. The triangles that this is made up of is invisible right now, but later I could show you guys how you can see those if you would like. And it's good to see them, especially if you're creating game assets. You don't need to these days, because most game engines can handle the complexity of quads, and you don't have to be too concerned about triangles, but it's good to know that they're there. Okay, so that's in the Modeling tab. The next tab here we have is Sculpting. So if you click on that, Blender goes into Sculpting mode. And Sculpting mode allows you to treat your 3D objects in Blender like they are clay. So like we have this this cube here, and with these different brushes over here, we have these different brushes right here on the bottom. We have this main brush here. We have brushes on the side. So this side panel is the Blender default tool panel, right? So if you go back to Layout, you'll see it looks a little bit different. So it has all the tools for layout and for basic things. If you go into Modeling, you see it change a little bit, because it actually adds some modeling tools to the panel. This panel always lives with you right here in the main 3D viewport, and it changes according to the operations you're going to do. So if you go into Sculpting, it's going to give you sculpting tools here, and we have some sculpting brushes down here. And you can, and any object that you have selected in Blender is going to treat it like digital clay or digital plasticine, where you can do sculpting. So you could take this cube and you could create, make this cube look like almost anything you can imagine, believe it or not. Then the next tab here is UV editing. Now UV editing, it's complex for a lot of people to understand what it is, but it's not that complex. So what UV editing basically is, if I select this entire box, right here is our 3D viewport, and right here is the UV editing viewport. So the UV editing tab allows you to take your 3D object and flatten it, like you have a box. If you have a box in real life, you can cut the sides and you could flatten it out. So that's what it did. It flattened out the box here on a sheet of paper, and this sheet of paper you could add colors to it, and it allows you to add, once you add colors to this, you actually add color to your 3D object. Or you can add an image in here and it'll put the image on the 3D object. And this allows you to get things like textures and stuff like that. This is the main place for like hand painting. If you want to paint on an object, is in the UV editing tab. If you want to add textures that you painted in another program like Photoshop or the GIMP, this is the tab that you would want to apply those things to. Let's go even further. So now the next tab next to UV editing is actually texture painting. So texture painting is almost the same thing as the UV editing tab, but it's just specific to actual paint, just straight up painting onto your object with a brush and colors. So that's what this is here. So we have the colors up, color palettes up here, just like Photoshop. If you click on it, you could change the colors around like so. And this SWAT up here, but we could get into that later. But that's what this window is here, is for you to this window is for you to be able to paint on your 3D object right here in the 3D scene. So that's what that texture painting tab. The next tab is shading. So it's going to take a little while here to jump over. Shading tab. Wow, this is taking a little while. So, I mean, while that's trying to jump over, I'm not sure. Oh, here we go. Oh, yep, okay. So should we finally in shading? So in shading, this allows you to create the material or surface properties of your model. Right? There's two different modes that you could go into in order to get two different kinds of shading. One is a real-time mode, which Blender defaults to, and it's their render engine called Eevee. Now, if you go over here to the top right of the screen above my head right here, there's a little icon called render. I'll show you guys what that look like. That icon right there that looks like a DSL camera. This one right here. So that icon, if you click on it, you would see it says up here render engine Eevee. So render engine Eevee is for real time. So if you're doing like game design and game art and that kind of thing, Eevee is great. Even if you're doing rendering for an like an animation or anything like that, you could still use Eevee, but Eevee is mostly for real time, and that's the best way to think about it for now if you're starting new with Blender. But if you click on Eevee, you'd see two other render engines, one called Workbench and the other one called Cycles. Workbench is for almost the same thing as Eevee, but it's a lot more efficient to just work in 3D. And Cycles is for like final movie type rendering. So if you want to do high quality rendered animations and certain kinds of special effects, you're going to use Cycles. And if you click on Cycles, it's there. So most times when I'm doing my tutorials, I go over to Cycles. Let's go back to Eevee. I'm going to describe these different panels here. So you see this panel above my head here that never really changes. So the first part of this panel, if you go to the different like the layout mode, you see it's the same thing here. This part here is called the outliner, and the outliner shows you everything you have in your 3D scene. So if I click on this, it shows me the camera, and see the camera is highlighted there. And if I click on cube, you'll see it selects the cube. It changes the cube outline orange because I have it selected here. And if I click on light, it'll select the light. So these are the three main objects I have in my scene. Now, these three objects are in something called a collection. A collection is like an invisible box that Blender likes to throw all these objects into. So if we go back to shading, you'll see that we still have that have that viewport, the outliner right here. Under that, then under the outliner, we have the properties panel. In the properties panel, right, we have tool tab, we have render, which is what I spoke about with Eevee and cycles. We have the output, which helps you to create images. You could change your image size if you're making a render for an image. A render means that the computer is going to draw a picture based upon your 3D scene. Right, then we have view layers, which is more towards like compositing and special effects. A very simplified version of what those things are. And then we have a scene tab. A scene tab is for like a scene camera and different things like that. We could get into that later. Like you could find your Blender units. So if you want to work on actual units like feet, right now it's in metric. So if you want to work on the imperial system, like work with feet or millimeters or and so on, you find all those options in here. We have the world tab, which is the world that you're looking through here in the 3D viewport. So here you can add a sky, or you could change the background color and so on and so forth. We could get into that later. Here under world, we have collections, which is again, collections are these invisible boxes where you could put organize your 3D objects into, so that you can keep things organized. So even though we see a collection here in the outliner that's created, we cannot see it in the viewport. It's just a way of organizing or grouping objects in Blender. Under that, we have object. Now the object tab is for any object that you have selected in the viewport, and it's going to show you different properties on the object. So if I selected the box, all of a sudden it's going to show me the location of the box, how the box is rotated, the scale, and so on and so forth. And there's other tabs for more information about the box. Under that is arguably the second most, or maybe even the first most important thing in the properties panel here in Blender, which is the modifiers. Most times when I'm working and modeling or even doing animation, I always have the model, this little icon here that looks like a wrench. I normally have the modifier tab open here under the properties tab, where I could add different modifiers to your objects. What modifiers actually do is to modify the object. It's different ways of modeling detail onto your object and doing different special deformations on your objects. We could get into that later, but that's what that tab is. And then after that, we have the particles tab. So this allows you to make particles in your 3D scene. So if you want to do things like rain, or you want to do clouds or even water, that's what the particles tab helps you with. Then we have the physics tab. So the physics tab allows you to add like physics type behavior to any object here in Blender. So what those are is like if something is hard, you know, like a box, it'll have a slight bounce to it. If it's a rubber ball, it's going to bounce higher. Or if it's glass, it's going to break. The physics, or if it's cloth, you know, it will get limp and loose. Or if it's rubber, it's going to be kind of bouncy. This is what all these different things, buttons here in the physics tab allow your objects to have those properties. Then there's constraints. Now constraints is specific to like animation, where you could add like these kind of invisible constraints to allow objects to interact with one another in a mechanical way, like bones or like gears and sprockets and so on and so forth. Under that is the data tab. Now this is like unique properties of any object that you have selected in a Blender. So if you select the camera, you get like the lens, the focal length of the lens, what kind of camera it is, and so on and so forth. If you select a cube, you're gonna get like different properties, like the vertex group properties, vertex groups. We could get into that later, exactly what those are, and shape keys. You know, there's those for like being able to do like facial animations and morphing and so on. And then there's like what I would consider the second or maybe even the third most important thing in the properties panel, which is right under the data tab, is the material tab. So the material tab is where, just like this viewport right here under the main 3D viewport, this here is the material node editor, right? So this is called the shader editor, and the shader editor shows you a graph, or shows you like a flowchart view of what this material tab is showing you. Here you can add color to your object, and you could add like shininess. You can make it look like metal, you can make it look like glass or like water. Like you can even make it look like wood and so on and so forth, and it controls the material properties, like how shiny or how dull an object can look, or if it looks like skin, if it's partly transparent or translucent. You find that here in the materials tab, and the shader editor helps you make the shader more complex and more realistic by adding different nodes here. So this is like a workspace, and under that we have texture, and here is where you can add textures to your shader or to your materials. We could get into these things later. So let's continue with the tabs up here in Blender. After the shading tab, you have the animation. So here's where you could add keyframes to an object or to some bones or character that you've made, and you can animate it and have it move around. So if we bring up our main toolbar here, and I click on the move icon, right? This allows me to move my object back and forth. But if you do it like that, there's no way that Blender is gonna record it for you to play back. So in order to do that, you come here in your animation tab, in the main animation tab, and you apply keyframes from this position here. Like I applied some keyframes. I just pressed a shortcut I to apply a keyframe, and then I move. If I want the box to move from here all the way up out of the screen, this is your camera viewport over here, and this is your working viewport. So this is what the cameras see, and this is what the camera is going to render. And I moved it there, and then I'm going to scroll here. Oh, excuse me, let's scroll first. I scroll first, let's say 20 frames here, and this here is your main dope sheet where you could add keyframes to, and there's also a curve editor, and animation is its own sort of thing, and you could set this up in however way you want it, but let's stick with the default. So I move the cursor here for the timeline. This is a timeline here under the dope sheet. Move it to 20 frames, and if I then move the cube up and then I press I to apply a keyframe, now if I pull back the playhead here, you see it's going to go back to the original position, and then if I move it, it's going to go up to 20 frames. So this is where you could do animations. So now if you press play, it's just going to play that animation of of the cube going up from that position. So this is where we can do character animation, we could do motion graphics, you could do all kinds of animation in Blender using, you could control the way your particles animate and the whole works right here under the animation tab, right? And you have all the tools to do it here. And you could even add more tools. Let's click on the render tab. So the render tab is where it's set up so that you could do your final render. So this shows you the render, the renders that you can do. So if you come here under render, you can render a single image from what your camera sees, or you could render an animation sequence, because an animation is made up of several images. So you could render your animations by clicking on that, and so on and so forth. And also in conjunction with this render tab here, there's also the output tab that helps you to output your keyframes if you're doing animations, or output your single frame image also. And we could dive into these things deeper. So now there's a compositing tab, and compositing is where you have all your final images of your animation, and then you could come in here and you could add effects to them, or you could merge two different animations together, so you could have like a bigger scene and so on and so forth. Compositing is its own kind of profession, just like animation and even modeling. So each of these tabs are kind of like different jobs for different people almost. This here is the compositor, and in here if you click use nodes, you could see it's going to create these compositing nodes where you could load in your image sequences, and you could make you could merge like live action with your animation. The whole works in here, and we could get into that later. Geometry nodes tab is where you have this special thing in Blender called geometry nodes that allow you to programmatically kind of model, use Blender to model complex models or shapes or procedural shapes. And it uses a node system. So say like I have this cube selected and I press new, it's going to show me the output of the cube, which is what we're seeing, and then the input of the cube, which is virtual, right, which is these vertices and all that sort of stuff. And in between we could add different node operations to change the art of this cube here. So you could change the model. So using geometry nodes, you could take this simple box, and using geometry nodes you could turn this into a house, you know, by using extrude and taper and different geometry node tricks, different nodes in here. So if I right click and I go add, you see there's a whole list section here of different nodes that you can add here to create this. Now geometry nodes is its own kind of field that you could get into. It's very new to Blender. It's fun, and it allows you to create complex models really quickly without having to program, you know, do a lot of programming. But it's good to have a good knowledge of how certain systems and programs work in order to use this, and we'll dive into that at some point and use a little bit of geometry nodes in the future. And then here is scripting. So this is using Python script, where you could create plugins for Blender. You could create scripts that do things like geometry nodes would do here, but this is purely scripting using Python. Is the main scripting language here in Blender. Once upon a time, when the Blender had the Blender game engine, you would come here and create scripts also to be used in the Blender game engine. So there's different templates in it to get you started, like add object. If you click on that template up here, so this is where you would type your Python script if you know Python and that kind of thing. We may touch this just a little bit. I'm not a heavy coder, but sometimes creating scripts for Blender to do repetitive operations is kind of cool. but geometry nodes actually help solve a lot of that, so you don't have to just deal with text. You could deal with these nice blocks. Let's go add here. You go geometry, read and write, curves. There's different operations you can do here for Blender, right? We could get into that. Yeah, this is what scripting is. So that's all the main rooms in Blender, guys. Let's go back to layout. So this is where I like to live the most. It's simple. We'll keep it like that. As I said, this is the basics of Blender. I showed you how to download the program, how to open the program up, and I told you what the different parts of Blender that you're seeing, what they are about. One last thing would be this toolbar on the side here is your main tools for Blender. The first one is a selection. If you click and hold down, you get different types of selections for Blender. You can leave it on the first one, which is the box selection, and you could draw a box to select any object or multiple objects in Blender, right? The one under the next tool under that is called the cursor. And what the cursor does is tell Blender the position where you want to create new things. So the 3D cursor is this little white and red target thing. So if I want to make a new object, let's create a new object. If I press Shift A, right, which is to add a new object, and say like I want to add a UV sphere, it's going to create it right where that 3D cursor is. To control the 3D cursor, all you have to do is just shift and right click in the viewport, and it's going to put the 3D cursor somewhere in the viewport. Or wherever that 3D cursor is, if I then press Shift A and say like I click mesh, under mesh, go add mesh, monkey, it's going to add the monkey right where that 3D cursor is. So if I shift right click on an object and the 3D cursor is on that object, and I go Shift A again to add a new object, and I add like, let's add like a torus, like a donut, it's going to add it right where that 3D cursor is. So that's what that is for. You could use it for many other things, but that's one of the main things for it. And under that is the move tool. We used the move tool earlier to move the cube and add keyframes. So if you click on the move tool, this is probably the tool that you mostly use a lot in Blender. So whatever object you have selected is the object you can move. So if you just click on an object, it will select it, and then the move tool will be ready to go on the object. So you can move the object in any part of the 3D. So in order to rotate your view, you see me rotate my view here in 3D. There's different ways to move it. So for now, the way I move it in Blender is to scroll your mouse wheel to zoom in and out, right? That's optically, like just whatever you see to zoom in and out. If you want to actually move in and out, you hold Shift and your middle mouse, and you could, or Alt. Some programs is Alt. Try Alt or Control. I'm holding Control, and I'm moving the middle mouse, and then moving my mouse up and down by holding my middle mouse button down, and I'm moving in and out. Now if you want to move from left to right, I'm going to hold my middle mouse and then Shift, and I'm moving from left to right. And if I want to rotate, I just have to hold the middle mouse button down and just rotate your view. Okay. You could change the behavior of how Blender navigates by going to File, or you can even go to your splash screen. Let's go to the splash screen first. So click on the Blender icon, go to splash screen, and here has different ways that Blender could behave. So the key map right now is Blender. If you look right here, and then there's let's see here. It's Blender, Blender 2.7x, and industry compatible. Alright, that's one way to change it. And then the other way is to come here on the edit and you go all the way to the bottom on the preferences. And then there's a navigation here where you could change options so that for the rotation of Blender. And then on the key map, you could change the keys, right? And how they behave here in Blender. And there's a whole list here, and you could go through and you could really customize Blender to behave a certain way so that you can navigate better in it if you're accustomed to Maya or 3D Studio Max. Okay, so going back to under the move tool here to your left, there's rotate. You could rotate any object by clicking on the rotate and then clicking on the object. So like the monkey head, and you could just rotate it. So in order to rotate or move, you have to click these colored lines in order to so if I click on the red color line, the monkey is going to rotate that way. If I stop, it's going to stop. And then I'm going to left click and hold on the green line, and the monkey could only rotate that way. If I do the blue line, if I click and hold and then move my mouse from left to right, the monkey is going to only rotate around that axis. So these are different axes. The different colors represent different axes in Blender. You can see the axes up here. So the blue is the Z axis. The Y, the green is the Y axis, and the red is the X axis. Same thing if you click on move. If you only click on the red arrow, it's going to move that way and that way on the X axis. And if you click on the green, it's going to move that way on the Y. And if you click on the blue, it's going to move that way on the Z. Okay, so below the rotate is scale. So scale allows you to make things bigger and smaller in Blender. So you could make things bigger just only in the Z and it'll stretch it that way. Or you could click on the X, which is the red one, and it would scale this way. Or you can click on the Y and it'll scale that way, right, which is the green one. Or if you click directly in the middle on this white circle, you could scale it uniformly bigger like that. Or you can click and hold and move your mouse the other way and you can make it small. So this is how you make things bigger and smaller in Blender. There's a nicer way to do it by coming up here to the top right of your viewport, clicking on this little arrow icon right here to open up the transform tab. This item tab has all the transforms. So it has the location, which moves the object around the viewport. It has the rotation, which helps you to rotate the object, and it has a scale that allows you to change the size of the object. Well, let's we don't need to see this right now. Okay, and then the last icon underneath here that we're gonna deal with is a transform icon, which does all three of these in one. So this is like a kind of like a combo icon. So if you click on that one, you get all three icons. You could get rotate, you could get move, and then you could, yep, and then you could get scale, and so on and so forth. So guys, yeah, so that's the basics of starting Blender up and knowing what these different parts are. We're gonna get into modeling maybe in the next tutorial, guys. Look out for it. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. I hope this helps someone out there who is trying to get into Blender from the very beginning. Thanks, and God bless. I'll see you guys later. It's xsinick, and don't forget to check out the xsinick show on Twitch and here on YouTube. Bye bye.